Sa'adiah Gaon. Rabbi Sa'adiah ben Yosef Gaon, RaSaG, Saʻīd b. Joseph, Saʻīd ben Joseph or Saʻadiah ben Joseph of Faym or Saʻadiah ben Joseph al-Fayyūmi, 882/892-942, was a prominent rabbi, Jewish philosopher, and exegete of the Geonic period who was active in the Abbasid Caliphate. The first important rabbinic figure to write extensively in Arabic, he is considered the founder of Judeo-Arabic literature. Known for his works on Hebrew linguistics, halakha, and Jewish philosophy, he was one of the more sophisticated practitioners of the philosophical school known as the Jewish Kalam. In this capacity, his philosophical work The Book of Beliefs and Opinions represents the first systematic attempt to integrate Jewish theology with components of Greek philosophy. Saʻīd was also very active in opposition to Karaism, in defense of Rabbinic Judaism. Saʻīd, in Sefer Haggadah, stresses his Jewish lineage, claiming to belong to the noble family of Shelah, son of Judah, and counting among his ancestors Hananiah ben Dosa, the famous ascetic of the 1st century. Expression was given to this claim by Saʻīd in calling his son Dosa. Regarding Joseph, Saʻīd's father, a statement of Aaron ben Meir has been preserved saying that he was compelled to leave Egypt and died in Jaffa, probably during Saʻīd's lengthy residence in the Holy Land. The usual epithet of al-Fayyūmi refers to Saʻīd's native place, the Fayyum in Upper Egypt. In Hebrew it is often given as Ptomi, derived from a contemporary identification of Fayyum with the biblical Pithom. At a young age he left his home to study under the Torah scholars of Tiberias. At age 20 Saʻīd began composing his first great work, the Hebrew dictionary, which he entitled Agron. At 23 he composed a polemic against the followers of Anan ben David, particularly Solomon ben Uraham, thus beginning the activity which was to prove important in opposition to Karaism, in defense of Rabbinic Judaism. In the same year he left Egypt and settled permanently in the land of Israel. In 922 a controversy arose concerning the Hebrew calendar, that threatened the entire Jewish community. Since Hillel II, the calendar had been based on a series of rules rather than on observation of the moon's phases. One of these rules required the date of Rosh Hashanah to be postponed if the calculated lunar conjunction occurred at noon or later. Rabbi Aaron ben Meir, the Gaon of the leading Talmudic academy in Israel, claimed a tradition according to which the cutoff point was 6:42/1080 of an hour after noon. In that particular year, this change would result in a 2-day schism with the major Jewish communities in Babylonia. According to Ben Meir, the first day of Passover would be on a Sunday, while according to the generally accepted rule it would be on Tuesday. Saʻīd was in Aleppo, on his way from the east, when he learned of Ben Meir's regulation of the Jewish calendar. Saʻīd addressed a warning to him, and in Babylon he placed his knowledge and pen at the disposal of the exilarch David ben Zakkai and the scholars of the academy, adding his own letters to those sent by them to the communities of the diaspora. In Babylonia he wrote his Sefer HaMoadim, or Book of Festivals, in which he refuted the assertions of Ben Meir regarding the calendar, and helped to avert from the Jewish community the perils of schism. His dispute with Ben Meir was an important factor in the call to Surah which he received in 928. The exilarch David ben Zakkai insisted on appointing him as Gaon, despite the weight of precedent, and against the advice of the aged Nissim Naruani, a Resh Kala at Surah, who feared a confrontation between the two strong-willed personalities, David and Saʻīd. Under his leadership, the ancient academy, founded by Rav, entered upon a new period of brilliancy. This renaissance was cut short, though, by a clash between Saʻīd and David, much as Nissim had predicted. In a probate case Saʻīd refused to sign a verdict of the exilarch which he thought unjust, although the Gaon of Pumbedita had subscribed to it. When the son of the exilarch threatened Saʻīd with violence to secure his compliance, and was roughly handled by Saʻīd's servant, open war broke out between the exilarch and the Gaon. Each excommunicated the other, declaring that he deposed his opponent from office, and David b. Zakkai appointed Joseph b. Jacob as Gaon of Surah, while Saʻīd conferred the exilarchate on David's brother Hassan. Hassan was forced to flee, and died in exile in Khorasan, but the strife which divided Babylonian Judaism continued. Sa'adiyah was attacked by the exilarch and by his chief adherent, the young but learned Aaron ibn Sargadu, in Hebrew pamphlets, fragments of which show a hatred on the part of the exilarch and his partisans that did not shrink from scandal. Sa'adiyah did not fail to reply. As much as Sa'adiyah's Judeo-Arabic translation of the Pentateuch has brought relief and succor to Jews living in Arabic-speaking countries, his identification of places, fauna and flora, and the stones of the breastplate, has found him at variance with some scholars. Abraham ibn Ezra, in his own commentary of the Pentateuch, wrote scathing remarks on Sa'adiyah's commentary, saying, "He doesn't have an oral tradition, perhaps he has a vision in a dream, while he has already erred with respect to certain places, therefore, we will not rely on his dreams." However, Sa'adiyah assures his readers elsewhere that when he rendered translations for the 20-odd unclean fowl that are mentioned in the Hebrew Bible, his translation was based on an oral tradition received by him. In fact, Sa'adiyah's method of conveying names for the fowls based on what he had received by way of an oral tradition, prompted him to add in his defense, "Every detail about them, had one of them merely come unto us, we would not have been able to identify it for certain, much less recognize their related kinds." The question often asked by scholars now is whether Sa'adiyah applied this principle in his other translations. Ram, as in Deuteronomy 33:17, improperly translated as unicorn in some English translations, is a word that is now used in modern Hebrew to represent the oryx, although Sa'adiyah understood the same word to mean rhinoceros, and writes there the Judeo-Arabic word for the creature. He interprets the zamir in Deuteronomy 14:5 as meaning the giraffe. In Sa'adiyah's translation and commentary on the Book of Psalms, he has done what no other medieval writer has done before him, bringing down a biblical exegesis and noting where the verse is to be read as a rhetorical question, and where the verse itself derides the question with good humor. Is the hill of God the hill of Bashan? A hunchback mountain is the hill of Bashan. Why leap yet, ye hunchback mountains? That mountain wherein God desires to dwell, even the Lord shall dwell forevermore. He wrote both in Hebrew and in Arabic a work, now known only from a few fragments, entitled Sefer HaGalui, in which he emphasized with great but justifiable pride the services which he had rendered, especially in his opposition to heresy. The 7 years which Sa'adiyah spent in Baghdad did not interrupt his literary activity. His principal philosophical work was completed in 933, and 4 years later, through Ibn Sargadu's father-in-law, Bishr ben Aaron, the two enemies were reconciled. Sa'adiyah was reinstated in his office, but he held it for only 5 more years. David b Zakkai died before him, being followed a few months later by the exilarch's son Judah, while David's young grandson was nobly protected by Sa'adiyah as by a father. According to a statement made by Abraham ibn Dud and doubtless derived from Sa'adiyah's son Dosa, Sa'adiyah himself died in Babylonia at Sura in 942, at the age of 60, of black gall, repeated illnesses having undermined his health. An anecdote is reported in Sefer Hasidim about Sa'adiyah ben Yosef the sage, in which he ends a dispute between a servant who claims to be the heir of his deceased master and the man's true son and heir by having them both draw blood into separate vessels. He then took a bone from the deceased man and placed it into each of the cups. The bone in the cup of the true heir absorbed the blood, while the servant's blood was not absorbed in the bone. Using this as genetic proof of the son's true inheritance, Sa'adiyah had the servant return the man's property to his son. Sa'adiyah translated the Torah and some of the other books of the Hebrew Bible into Judeo-Arabic, adding a Judeo-Arabic commentary. Sa'adiyah translated Megillat Antiochus into Judeo-Arabic and wrote an introduction. Saʻīd Gaon was a pioneer in the fields in which he toiled. The foremost object of his work was the Bible. His importance is due primarily to his establishment of a new school of biblical exegesis characterized by a rational investigation of the contents of the Bible and a scientific knowledge of the language of the holy text. Sa'adiyah's Arabic translation of the Torah is of importance for the history of civilization, itself a product of the Arabization of a large portion of Judaism, it served for centuries as a potent factor in the impregnation of the Jewish spirit with Arabic culture, so that, in this respect, it may take its place beside the Greek Bible translation of antiquity and the German translation of the Pentateuch by Moses Mendelssohn. As a means of popular religious enlightenment, Sa'adia's translation presented the scriptures even to the unlearned in a rational form which aimed at the greatest possible degree of clarity and consistency. His system of hermeneutics was not limited to the exegesis of individual passages, but treated also each book of the Bible as a whole, and showed the connection of its various portions with one another. The commentary contained, as is stated in the author's own introduction to his translation of the Pentateuch, not only an exact interpretation of the text, but also a refutation of the cavils which the heretics raised against it. Further, it set forth the basis of the commandments of reason and the characterization of the commandments of revelation. In the case of the former, the author appealed to philosophical speculation, of the latter, naturally, to tradition. The position assigned to Saʻīd in the oldest list of Hebrew grammarians, which is contained in the introduction to Abraham ibn Ezra's Maznaim, has not been challenged even by the latest historical investigations. Here, too, he was the first. His grammatical work, now lost, gave an inspiration to further studies, which attained their most brilliant and lasting results in Spain, and he created in part the categories and rules along whose lines was developed the grammatical study of the Hebrew language. His dictionary, primitive and merely practical as it was, became the foundation of Hebrew lexicography, and the name Agron, which he chose and doubtless created, was long used as a designation for Hebrew lexicons, especially by the Karaites. The very categories of rhetoric, as they were found among the Arabs, were first applied by Saʻīd to the style of the Bible. He was likewise one of the founders of comparative philology, not only through his brief book of 70 words, already mentioned, but especially through his explanation of the Hebrew vocabulary by the Arabic, particularly in the case of the favorite translation of biblical words by Arabic terms having the same sound. Saadia's works were the inspiration and basis for later Jewish writers, such as Barakia in his encyclopedic philosophical work Sefer Hadaber. Saʻīd likewise identifies the definitive trait of a cock girded about the loins within Proverbs 30:31 as the honesty of their behavior and their success, rather than the aesthetic interpretations of so many others, thus identifying a spiritual purpose of a religious vessel within that religious and spiritual instilling schema of purpose and use. In his commentary on the Sefer Yetzirah, Saʻīd sought to render lucid and intelligible the content of this esoteric work by the light of philosophy and scientific knowledge, especially by a system of Hebrew phonology which he himself had founded. He did not permit himself in this commentary to be influenced by the theological speculations of the Kalam, which are so important in his main works. In introducing Sefer Yetzirah's theory of creation, he makes a distinction between the biblical account of creation ex nihilo, in which no process of creation is described, and the process described in Sefer Yetzirah. The cosmogony of Sefer Yetzirah is even omitted from the discussion of creation in his magnum opus Kitab al-Amanat wal-Itayadot. Concerning the supposed attribution of the book to the patriarch Abraham, he allows that the ideas it contains might be ancient. Nonetheless, he clearly considered the work worthy of deep study, and echoes of Sefer Yetzirah's cosmogony do appear in Kitab al-Amanat wal-Itayadot when Saʻīd discusses his theory of prophecy.